Okay, I think we will get started. We are on the hour. So, welcome everyone to our talk today called Honoring Reconciliation in Evaluation, an introduction. And we're really pleased that you could join us to hear Andrea Johnston share some of her wisdom with us. So, we have two hosts for today. I'm Rebecca Gokert, and I'd like to offer welcome from the Evaluation Capacity Network at the University of Alberta.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michelle Searle, and I would like to offer a welcome from Queen's University, the Assessment and Evaluation Group.
Excellent. So just a quick outline of what we will cover today. We want to share some short introductions and our commitments to decolonizing evaluation. We're going to hear from Andrea for about 30 minutes. We will round out the session with some question and answer that Michelle and I will facilitate. And as Andrea is presenting though, please feel free, get your questions in the chat or in the Q&A because we're going to be mining those for the facilitated session later, and we want to make sure that we capture those. And so don't hold on to them as they come up. Be sure to ask as things come up for you. So just moving on, I would like to start our time together today by acknowledging the land where I work, live, play, and call home, which is Amiskwaci Waskahikan, and it's situated in Treaty 6 and Region 4 of the Métis Nation of Alberta, the home and traditional lands of many Indigenous people. I would also like to acknowledge that many of the folks, of course, and many of you have been doing that, thank you very much, in the chat, are joining from other traditional lands, including my co-host, Michelle, who's on the traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, and our guest, Andrea Johnston, who's joining us from the Toronto area, which is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We are committed to working towards equity and justice, and may acknowledging this help us to be good neighbors to one another, good stewards of the land, and good ancestors to all our children. We're really grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. So I would like to hand it over to my co-host, Michelle, to share some of the work that we have been doing in partnership around our commitments to decolonizing and reconciliation in evaluation.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. About this time, a year ago, the ECN formed a working group with the purpose of mapping a plan for intentional thinking and collaborative action about equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, anti-racism, and decolonizing, indigenizing evaluation. It was quite a scope of work to start to look at all of these concepts. And part of the initial working group included efforts to scan equity and decolonizing statements to understand the purpose, position, and use of these statements in different organizational group and evaluation contexts. And another early focus was the identification of 62 resources related to decolonizing evaluation. So we'll be sharing a link to that today. It's in the repository of the ECN. But we've been on this journey now for about the last 6 months, as I mentioned. And really, I think a marker in this journey as part of this plan was developing the ECN commitments. So these were jointly crafted with a process involving input from Indigenous evaluation advisors, multiple network members, faculty leads, and students. In articulating these commitments, which you can see on the slide, we recognize that the terms may not fully resonate across all communities and contexts. However, the statement itself is a representation of our awareness as the ECN about the challenge of colonial and oppressive practices in program evaluation, and a willingness to work towards uplifting multiple and diverse voices as part of our capacity building efforts within the field of evaluation. We'd like to acknowledge that fulfilling these commitments will be a journey, and we are still in early stages of this journey. It's a process of learning that involves being responsive to communities that we're serving and working with others. And that's part of why we're so delighted that many of you are with us today and that we have Andrea here to help guide us with our continued learning. I'd like to move now to introducing and welcoming Andrea Johnston. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today. We're glad that you're here as we continue our discussions on Indigenous evaluation. For folks who are joining the call, you need to know that Andrea is the founder of Johnston Research, Inc., and she is a national expert in Indigenous evaluation techniques and a trainer of Indigenous evaluation. Andrea is an innovator. She uses artistic and technological approaches to enhance Indigenous evaluation practices and in promoting self-evaluation knowledge. Andrea has worked in the field of evaluation for over 20 years, partnering with over 50 First Nations, 30 Métis, and 12 Inuit communities for research and case studies. We're honored to have you with us today, Andrea, to share your expertise. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to turn it over to you now so that you can begin to share with us about the Indigenous Evaluation Network.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Rebecca. Really glad to be here. I would like to start off with speaking about a new initiative that got started last year. We held for the first time in February 2024 the Indigenous Evaluation Summit, and with some funding from several funders, but really the Ontario Trillium Foundation really supported us in opening our doors to do some good work this year for the Indigenous Evaluation Network. So just do a quick presentation. If we go to the next slide. At the summit, I don't want to go through too many details here. I believe, are the PowerPoints available afterwards? I wasn't clear on that. Yeah, so you'll be able to look at the information closely at that point. On this page, I just want to highlight what we did at the summit. We had 225 delegates attending an online Zoom meeting, with 45 of those participants being Indigenous youth. We had 8 presentation panelists. Some of those included Dan George as a keynote, Indigenous Services Canada, PRA Inc., the Mind Fuel Foundation, Workforce Warriors, Nota Bay 3 Foundation, Network Environments for Indigenous Health Research. Next slide. Some of the things that were really liked about the summit were having some rooms that had special guests and elders that people can meet, listen, and learn from, as well as hosting lunchtime networking hours. Some of the topics we covered, and we had very motivated, very much dedicated participation in these lunchtime networks, where we talked about sovereignty, youth, elders, and ceremony. Finally, we started the conversation with all delegates on the Indigenous governance of Indigenous Evaluation Network. Next slide. So we're starting a new path, and we want to look at what's the immediate and short-term milestones for the Indigenous Evaluation Network. Next slide. One of the main activities that we've achieved with the IEN is sort of stating what we're about. And this is actually featuring Elder Pauline Shirt, who was my elder for many, many years. And she's now passed away, just so you all know, just only 2 weeks ago. But she'll be forever in my heart. The network enables new, emerging, and experienced Indigenous evaluators and Indigenous program service providers to connect, network, build capacity, engage in mentorship, and expand the field of Indigenous evaluation by providing a central resource and hosting network opportunities for the benefit of Indigenous communities. And the one thing I want to let you know is that both Indigenous and non-Indigenous evaluators and program service providers are all welcome to join the network as a member. Currently, right now, we have 171 members. Next slide. In terms of our path forward, we would like you to think about joining our Lunch and Learns. We have 3 topics. Those include beginners, advanced, and also a category for people who don't know who the evaluation respondents are, where they have to undertake a little bit more work to contact those individuals. And as well, we're hoping to do more presentations on the Indigenous Evaluation Network, as well as Indigenous evaluation. Next slide. We are in the talks right now with two organizations, the Network for Indigenous Health Research and also the Future Skills Center, which are the NEARS, the first one that I just mentioned, are located in academic institutions across Canada. And the Future Skills Center is located in Toronto Metropolitan University. And so we want to work with these two pilot projects to bring elders, youth, and former Indigenous Evaluation Network Planning Committee members to support a dialogue and shape the process. We're hoping to have a summer institute. We're looking at having 2 days this summer, and we will have the ability to create enthusiasm for Indigenous evaluation and its expansion, produce a report on decolonizing evaluation practices in Canadian institutions, and produce a checklist template geared at decolonizing of institutions, applying the lens of Indigenous evaluation perspectives. Now, I just want to warn you, it's not that it's a one-size-fits-all. The template is not meant to be rigid, and we'll be looking to have a lot of flexibility in that tool. Next slide. So I don't want to spend too much time here. I'll just say that we want to have some social media happening from the Summer Institute with photos and videos that we would do over a 6-month schedule. We want to focus on the stories, the steps and approaches identified and explained by the two institutions. And from the pilot work, we want to publish the template, which is based upon truth and reconciliation, and the knowledge gained from Indigenous elders and youth and the experiences shared by the two institutions. Next slide. We want to look at what is our revenue sources as an independent entity moving forward. And we feel that this template we talked about on Indigenous decolonization could support our collection of funds for the network. We are looking at being a charity over the next year. And so once people are utilizing the template that is developed through the network, there could be a type of payment back to the network that would not be based on paying for the knowledge, because we do believe that knowledge is free. And rather, we would be looking at it's a matter of respect and understanding the hard work that the network went through to develop the template. So it's a matter of just giving respect back to honor that hard work that we did to develop the template. Next slide. So I'm not going to go into details here, but we also have been supporting through the network expansion of the Awakening the Journey Vision model, which was developed a couple of years ago. It's a tool for supporting what is an Indigenous evaluation framework. Next slide. So I just want to illustrate here how we are supporting the expansion of knowledge and the expansion of current tools. We had originally, with the Awakening the Journey Vision model, had 3 pillars: spirit, relationship, and process. And through the work that we did with Parks Canada, Indigenous Guardians programs, in speaking with the Indigenous Guardians, they supported us in erecting a 4th pillar. They really like the idea of having 4 pillars because that works really well with the fact that a medicine wheel has 4 sectors, and can include mind, body, spirit, emotion. It can include north, south, west, east, many different dynamics in a medicine wheel. And so this 4th pillar is the unknown. And one of the statements I would just make here is keeping the space open for the new day and new spirit, accepting our strengths and feeding our spirits. And then secondly, being on top of things, but recognizing we don't know everything, prepare ourselves for each day. Next slide. So just in closing on the network, we are looking for people to sign up to join a governance committee. So we are hoping that these would be Indigenous persons working for Indigenous not-for-profit or charity organizations. So if you do know any, they don't have to be evaluators, but if you do know any individuals who are Indigenous, do please direct them towards us, as we would like to get the work happening in terms of finalizing what is the Indigenous governance for the Indigenous Evaluation Network. So now I'd like to sign up for the, continue here with the next slide here. Thank you. So this is the main presentation to just sort of begin this conversation around what is Indigenous evaluation and how do we walk in terms of what steps do we take in this journey. On this picture here, we have a square and a circular lens on the glasses. In some ways, is thinking about two-eyed seeing. I have also heard about three-eyed seeing, but the three-eyed seeing is mainly being talked about around Indigenous people. And so they'll talk about having the upbringing in their own community as the one-eyed seeing. The second-eyed seeing, they talk about their academia and how they bring Indigenous knowledge into their academia work. And then the third-eyed seeing is the Western perspective. Okay, next slide. When we look at human behavior, we have a lot of things to talk about here. One of the things is the fact that many cultures share many different activities that are seen as acts, and achieving goals, meeting responsibilities, and acting expected roles and nurturing relationships are very common acts across many cultures. So before we go into looking what the details are in those acts, we'll just look at the A to Z graphic on the side. When we think about a logic model, you could really break it up into three pillars. That would be short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. When we think about what is an Indigenous path through a program, we look at the blue slide, the bottom slide graphic with the A to Z. And I was actually in Yukon, Whitehorse, Yukon, doing a meeting. No, I think I might have been in Carcross Taglish First Nation doing the meeting, talking about evaluation. And that's in, sorry, what did I just say? Close to Whitehorse. So the A to Z here, we have a back and forth and sort of an up and down. And the thing to make a point here is with the Z, we can have a lot of thinking around what the Z is. So really logic models are meant to predict what are the outcomes. However, in Indigenous programs, many times more than not, they would actually sort of circumvent the Z and actually achieve many of the outcomes that are achieved go beyond what we thought could be achieved. And so we need to have an openness in our evaluation in order to capture what are those ideas. Because one of the restrictions we have, say, with survey data is we have validity with surveys because we ask everybody the same question. Now, there's a lot of issues alone with surveys because the actual questions can be misinterpreted or misunderstood. And as well, some of the words in those questions can be triggering in Indigenous settings. And further, by and another thing that surveys do is it asks us to fit into the boxes. So we can really have a lot of issues with fitting into a box and instead not having a more exploratory approach. Next slide. So what I want to say here just briefly is, what is achieving goals from a Western or Indigenous approach? And when we put it into this type of table, it's not meant to say one is right, one is wrong. We're in no way giving a mark here or giving a judgment. We're simply trying to just look at what is usually thought about. And definitely, I don't see any argument that a Western approach is very much centered on achieving goals in school and in work. We have performance reviews in work settings, and those look at if you're achieving your goals. With an Indigenous approach, there may be different priorities and goals. And if we get into the second row, meeting responsibilities, we can understand that better. With the Indigenous approach, the highest priorities may be responsibilities to the natural world and the treaties held with the animals. What if you look back at treaty making, actually Indigenous people here in Canada were making treaties long before the Westerners came onto the lands. And they were actually making treaties with the animals and the natural world. And that was their first treaty. And this is a teaching that was given to me by John Boros, a Indigenous lawyer. So when we look at enacting expected rules, again, if we look on the Indigenous side, roles are socially learned after the natural world rules that are learned through engagement with the natural world. So when we think about this land-based work on the land activities, this is seen as a very good engagement for Indigenous people. And as well, there are some schools that are doing a lot more outdoors learning for the students. And so when we think about what are the rules, for example, what are they learning in the forest? Well, you may ask that. And when I worked with Judith's Place in Six Nations of the Grand River, one of the practitioners that were learning Indigenous healing told me that she had experienced the plants talking to her. So it is as if the forest is her classroom, literally, because she is learning how to pick the plants, how to harvest them, how to renew them, and how to use them medically. And she was learning all of this information just by engaging with the plants alone. So we hear these stories over and over again. As well, things people tell me that the language, if they just go in the forest, they can hear the language. They're learning new words, new vocabulary, new ways of thinking. And these are all learned in the forest. So these are all things we have to realize, that there is actually another way that rules can be learned. I'm going to go to the next slide. I think I would just want to get through the information. This, I think we're going to skip too much, but I just want to reiterate that every time I talk to an elder, and any elder, they will tell me what do they want to see included in Indigenous evaluation. And they will always say spirit, mind, body, and emotions. Next slide. So what is spirit, mind, body, emotion? Just quickly, and I did work with a number of elders to do these definitions, and they're very apprehensive about having definitions written down on paper. But these are just kind of good for our learning. They're not in any way meant to be thought of as a dictionary, as the languages are mostly verbal and oral. So what is spirit? It stays strong and true to the course of our true path. And that's where we get back to having naming ceremonies, because when an individual is given a spirit name, it is said that their journey here on earth is to foster and grow within that spirit journey of the spirit name. The mind leads, desires change, understands complexity of change. So again, when we talk about what are people's motives for changing because of a program implementation, again, we can go to the mind, but as well, we can go to the emotions, because the emotions are doorways to our true feelings and can help shift change as well. Further, the body can help keep us down, but also works to keep us up. So, for example, I experienced this most in my personal life with going to the gym and exercising. Once you get over that hump and you get into the commitment to the gym or exercising, running or walking or biking, then your body desires it. Your body is going to force you to get on that bike tomorrow, because it starts to feel that energy from that activity. Next slide. So self-actualization, I sort of hinted into this a little bit when I started talking about the naming ceremony. There's other things we do for self-actualization, but what should be known is Indigenous people and many other people believe that we're all born self-actualized. Another thing that people think about is being innovators. So these kind of things are intertwined, but there's a lot of information about people being born, all people are born innovators. So they kind of go hand in hand. And when we think about what is self-actualization, it's the spiritual connections that support healthy development of children. And so there could be upsets in esteem, love, belonging, safety, and disconnecting from spiritual connection. And that's why you're always hearing Indigenous people want to connect back to their culture. They want to connect back to their teachings, because they want to repair this self-actualization, which is a very important part. And if we go into the next slide, we can see how this is very relevant. If we go to the next slide, we can see how this is very relevant to evaluation. Because when we develop our logic models or our theory of change, we are doing just that. We're incorporating many different ideas of behavior theory into our predictive models. One of those behavior theories often is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so it's very important to look at this because it's a good comparative for what is self-actualization. When we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he goes from a physiological need to a transcendence in where this is a population pyramid, basically. So most of the population is down at the bottom. They are thought to never transcend, and only a small number of people will self-actualize and transcend according to Maslow. The other important thing to note here is the individual rights to privilege, and also that this is a one lifetime scope of analysis. So again, this privileged approach and this kind of insular approach to analysis. So it's an individual-based approach. When we look at the Blackfoot, this is a teepee design here, and we have self-actualization at the bottom. So when I talked about that spirit journey, it's a very good example of self-actualization, because when someone understands from a very small child, and the elders tell parents, for example, to say this spirit name to their child on a regular basis. So example, tucking them in to bed at night. You would talk to their spirit by saying goodnight as well to their spirit name. And so this is very much reinforced from a very young age. And when someone can articulate, well, what is their journey here on earth? This is very much giving protective factors, self-confidence, and as they can see that they're achieving this goals and this path through their life's journey, then this is a reinforcement of the self-actualization. And with the Blackfoot, they look at community actualization as the next step, and then cultural perpetuity. So we need to have these steps in place to support the livelihood and the integrity of the culture. And you'll note here on the side, expansive concepts of time and multiple dimensions of reality. Now, I could just go into days and days of teachings as what is expansive concepts of time. But what I can say there is this here, this expansive concepts of time, multiple dimensions of reality, this is where we go with the cultural perpetuity, the self-actualization, the community actualization. This is all within a cultural framework. And these dimensional understandings are all part and parcel of this way of thinking, way of doing, way of knowing, way of being. So it's very important when we're doing evaluation then to recognize, well, what are the behavior-based theories that we've included in our frameworks? And how do we incorporate more indigenous-based thinking, ways of knowing, ways of being into our frameworks? Next slide. So we did talk here about the journey of life through the self-actualized individual. One of the things I also want to talk about is this idea of smudging, which they're also doing in this picture here, is meeting with elders, doing things with elders, getting elders connected to the young ones, and this idea of smudging and looking at what we have as gifts. So the whole idea of smudging, for example, is another form of self-actualization, because what the smudging does is the whole concept of it is that, so normally, you know, a large number of us, I'm not saying everybody, and maybe not even a large number, but a number of us will shower in the morning each day. And that's a way of kind of waking up, bringing on the new day, and washing away the old skin. So when we do the smudging, we want to do that on a daily basis, and we also want to by smudging, we want to sort of smudge out the negative energy, and we want to so when you have jewelry, if you're wearing jewelry, for example, sometimes people will take it off, but if you're wearing it daily, my teaching as well is that you can smudge the jewelry as well, and then you go about smudging yourself, because the thing is, jewelry can hold negative energy as well. But if you're always, because if you put jewelry down in your jewelry case and you don't wear it for a while, it has a way of collecting that negative energy. So that is something that we will usually smudge before we wear it, to take away any negativity and to ensure that we're taking in positivity and ensuring that we have a strong spiritual connection and a clear mind and a knowledge of what is our true path. Next slide. So one thing I just want to talk about really quickly here is neuroplasticity. I would like to, I'm going to look up the link. There's a really good video on Vimeo by Michael Yellowbird, where he's looking at neurodecolonization of the mind. And what he's done is, as it's an evolving discipline, he's looked at how we do brain scans of Indigenous ceremonies. And he has actually taken a before scan and an after scan of the brain. And what does the brain look like before and after an Indigenous ceremony? So they could actually map out now that the effects of ceremonies are similar to mindfulness training. And so there's a lot of research around what are the outcomes and the outputs of mindfulness training. And so he says in this video, this link I'd like to share with you, if someone could actually just Google on the team there, Dr. Michael Yellowbird Vimeo, you'll get the link. Perfect. Thank you. And so what he actually says in this video here is that there's a number of hours that you do mindfulness training for, that you'll have X, Y, Z results. And so what we're moving into now is there are other tools out there that can support us in learning what is happening from Indigenous ceremonies. Because one thing elders will say is you cannot, and we should not, and I really feel strongly, we should not be evaluating what is the outcomes of ceremonies, because that is more a very spiritual thing. But instead, well, okay, so then you say, well, how do I write my data down? Well, this neuroplasticity discipline is a good way to go, because they're starting to document what is a brain scan and what are the outcomes associated with these activities. And so they already can tell you if someone did X activity, then they're going to get Z outcomes. And so then we don't really need to be talking to everyone, did you get these Z outcomes? It's actually a given that these will happen. It's just going to be the intensity and the tracking over time. Next slide. So we have the goal setting, and we talked about this, what is in a logic model. And I just want to reiterate another example of what is loaded into logic models. And that is this idea of a starting point and success at an end point. And the different types of goal setting frameworks are usually built right into how the logic model kind of goes from a step 1, and then you have an arrow, a step 2, step 3, step 4. So it's very similar thinking, and we need to be aware of what are Indigenous people doing around goal setting. Yes, we do have goals. So I have talked to example for Mark Wedge in Carcross Taglish First Nation. He's a former chief, and he was an elder at the time when I was there. And he told me, yes, we do go fishing. And I do have the goal of catching a fish, but that's not my only goal. So normally here with the start and the success, the fish would be identified as the success. But one of the things we miss by not doing a more storytelling approach is we can miss the fact that he's having a lot of laughs with loved ones out on the lake. He's engaging with nature. He's meditating. He's clearing his mind, getting a lot of important mental health relaxation into this as well. So there's a lot of things we can miss as to what are the other benefits. So what if he doesn't come back with a fish? Does he say he's a failure? No, because he has all those other things that were important to him that he was doing there while he was out on the lake. And next slide. So another thing we want to talk about is how we develop logic models and evaluation frameworks. And typically, we look at the A to type personality and being in the office. And why is the A type personality in the office? Because they're the ones who would pass the job interview. The way job interviews are designed, normally you need to be an A type personality to get the job. So you'd have a lot of these individuals employed in the offices in a removed setting and not necessarily on the ground, getting an understanding of what are the needs and priorities according to communities. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Andrea. You've given us lots to think about for sure. And we've had lots of questions coming up in the chat. Thank you for proposing a video that we could include. I don't know about others, but I've already copied the link and opened up the tab. I suspect many have. We've been harvesting some questions that we can pose to you. And the first one that I see is, how does one become an evaluator? And I'm wondering if someone meant, how does one become an Indigenous evaluator? Do you have a piece of advice from your perspective for those who are starting out in evaluation?
Well, I hope that's something that the Indigenous Evaluation Network can support moving forward. I think definitely the lunch and learns are a good format for people to join us. They'll be very much dialogue. They're not going to be education based. We'll have some questions that we want to answer as a group in the lunch and learns, and certainly it'll be an area where people can talk about these issues, certainly in the beginner level lunch and learn, because I think that is definitely a question that needs to be further explored.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense for sure. Someone has asked a question here about outcomes related to ceremony, and if the outcomes related to ceremony are widely understood and recognized by non-Indigenous evaluators. Do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, so I think, well, at one point we were out in BC a few years back, and they had a potlatch for the first time. And a lot of the times people would call that a process. However, for that community, it was an outcome. So I think we need to look at how we are defining outcomes more, and ceremony outcomes, definitely, I feel the link to Dr. Michael Yellowbird, he has a whole list of them in there, and certainly there's a lot of things that can happen for people from ceremonies, and but definitely in terms of the brain scan activity, that is one way to measure, but of course there's many other different results from ceremonies. It wouldn't just be related to brain scan activities.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andrea. I was thinking more about that. How does one become an evaluator? Probably, like many of us, accidentally. We're all formally trained, and by attending conversations like this and getting excited about it. I'm curious, just kind of following up on some of the comments in the chat. And one person said, thank you very much. Impact stories certainly help capture some of those nuances of a program beyond just, are we measuring our outcomes? Are we following through with our activities? One person did ask, so how might we reflect broader goals in a logic model if we're, kind of taking your approach?
Yeah, well, the Awakening the Journey example that I that you'll have that snapshot in the presentation. We started to look at what are different pillars to be focused on. So as I mentioned with the logic model, you could reduce it to 3 pillars: input, intermediate, and outcome. But with the Awakening the Journey vision model, we have 4 pillars now: spirit, process, relationship, and the unknown. And one of the so process, I think you'd be pretty comfortable working with process. You could understand what's a process. But what the Awakening the Journey vision model does is very different from the logic model, because the logic model is actually predicting what activities, outputs, outcomes should occur based on the intervention. But the Awakening the Journey model takes a different approach to the evaluation, and it actually says what would be the in total, it's a process focused mechanism. And so instead it's looking at what is the process that is expected to happen if you implement an intervention, what processes would occur. And so we are looking at relationship building is very important to Indigenous people. Anytime, anywhere I go, relationship building is key. And one of the complaints I always had was collecting quantitative data, just sort of bean counting relationships. And instead, they want to have more in-depth understanding of the relationship. And as well, time and time again, when I work with Indigenous organizations, they'll talk about how the staff will bring Indigenous knowledge and culture into the relationships. And so getting at that, how does the culture, so the Awakening the Journey vision talks about how is culture and respect for culture being incorporated into the evaluation. And as well, spirit, one of the things we talk about is different ceremonies that can be done to start the evaluation, but as well, in spirit, we're looking at having flexible funding mechanisms in place. And so we now, for the first time, because typically with the logic model, those factors would be out of scope. And so one of the things we're asking with Indigenous evaluation is to start looking at the funding mechanism. And if the funding mechanism design was designed in such a way that it actually supported the program, or did it have barriers to supporting the program implementation? So that's under spirit. And as well under spirit, we don't just look at ceremonies, because through some of the work, we've also worked with non-natives who are doing a lot of work in Indigenous communities. And one of the things we found was that quite often the most successful initiatives, especially where they do very good relationship building with the Indigenous communities, but one of the ways that they're successful is the team-based approach. And the team is a strengths-based approach with the team, and the team is a very positive, supportive environment. So that could be something that is seen as spirit, because it's a team spirit. So again, there's different ways to look at that.
Mhm. Wonderful, thank you. There are a number of other, Andrea, the links and the resources you've already shared. Of course, Michelle and I were signing up and registering. And we've had some other suggestions as well. And what we can do is we'll compile those and send them out as a package. So we have things like Eval Indigenous Peoples and Evaluation through AEA. Even, CES, we know, has many of those, Canadian Evaluation Society. I just wanted to follow up because you were starting to talk about kind of funders, and there was a question around, does the evaluation methodology pose any challenges in obtaining funding, or with some of the so-called gatekeepers, or what we might identify as gatekeepers, like foundations, governments? One of the participants has experienced this barrier when they've used more story-led, qualitative, or experiential programs in their evaluation. I'm just curious what your experience has been with that.
Well, I'm a third-party evaluator myself, so I come into the picture when the implementation has already occurred.
Mm.
But what we've done when I get on board, because they may have promised to fit into their framework up until the point when I come on board. So one of the strengths is talking to the funder, having meetings with the funder. So having the client and the funder and myself on a call. And I have found that when we have these dialogue meetings and conversations about where we're going with the evaluation, listening to them, having flexibility, and so having a give back and forth flow of ideas and conversating has been a very strong support for moving forward. And actually, it was early days that I worked with the Ontario Chilean Foundation with the Native Women's Resource Center of Toronto. And then I don't know if that in part supported the evaluation shop to be more receptive, but after I had done about 2 projects on a community-based approach, working with the OTF and its funding templates, 2 years later, I actually was invited in to do a training with the entire evaluation shop.
So again, back to relationships.
Yeah, yeah. And isn't that a nice outcome when the whole process actually shifts as a result of some of the learning? Yeah.
Mhm.
Folks were asking in the chat, Andrea, if there are major differences in how Indigenous evaluation would unfold in rural versus urban areas. And I'm wondering if there are other indicators of difference or other dimensions of difference that are worth considering as one is looking at Indigenous evaluation.
Difference of which?
The question was about urban versus rural, using Indigenous evaluation frameworks in urban versus rural areas.
Oh, I think that's something we're going to be talking about with the network with the Lunch and Learns, because when you get into the urban setting, people will usually be telling me that it's more difficult to get a hold of the population. The population's more diversified and more spread out in the urban setting. And so that would be the third Lunch and Learn when you don't know who the population is. And so what I found with the urban versus rural is that in the rural area, it's a lot easier. We've found it a lot easier to get participation. Because we did a lot of work with Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers. And so we would go up north to Sudbury, Thunder Bay. But we find in the rural areas that actually there's better participation.
Interesting, eh? Yeah. I wonder if that has to do with relationships in the rural areas and communities.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing. The workers are much more down to earth. I mean, we learned when we were up there in North Bay from one of the workers to put mayonnaise in the scone. So we weren't just talking evaluation, we were talking recipes.
Yeah, yeah. There was a guest speaker who came to Queens not that long ago, speaking about Indigenous frameworks and the kitchen table methodology, and then the kind of conversations and dialogues that unfold. I'm changing tracks here. Another question that was asked was about the main indicators of community actualization, and what would that look like if you were to try to crystallize that for folks?
Yeah, actually, I wasn't prepared, but I have a really good file I could share with you. I'll have to look it up. But Darian Thera in 2019 wrote a sort of like a dissertation on just that very question. And so she had 3 transformations for communities, and one of them is colonization as a disease, second, culture is the cure, and third, community is the medicine. So the community actualization is exactly what she describes in community as the medicine. So I wouldn't be able to go into too much detail, but it's really getting in with opportunities, getting away from deficit-based thinking, getting into strength-based thinking with communities, and being very opportunity-based. Because it was actually Mark Wedge again who told me that Indigenous people are opportunists. So we'll carry styrofoam in our car, and as soon as we see a porcupine on the side of the road, we'll collect the needles.
That's awesome. That really echoes what we've just had a post put in by Janice, who talked about being concerned about some of the deficit approaches and the way that evaluation continues to harm. And what I'm hearing about community actualization really flips that deficit model and thinking about the harm of evaluation. It creates a new opportunity for it.
Mhm.
Agreed.
I think we might have time for 1 or 2 more questions, Andrea. So there were 2 comments around the fishing analogy, and I think people really appreciated that and it resonated with them. One of the comments was just in terms of the analogy, thinking that would the fish be the output with relationship building, communication, and engaging with nature as the outcomes. So that's sort of part 1. And then the second piece is an individual that identifies as a settler and works in public health, and often creates programs with a single focus. So she was wondering if you had any words of wisdom or frameworks that might help settlers engage with taking action that seek to have a potential of a variety of outcomes, and how to consider that in planning the evaluation. Sorry, that was a big both of them were related to the fishing analogy.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good way of thinking of it. But I think really we have to do a lot of work around identifying outcomes in communities and supporting communities to identify their own outcomes. Because one thing I said is, well, it's all fine and dandy to say, oh, we're going to do capacity building and we're going to start asking the workers to develop the outcomes. What's a community-based outcome? But the difficulty is it's going to take a lot of work because they had been answering templates, reporting templates, year after year after year. And so she knows how to fit her mind into the template. And so basically what you're going to get is a regurgitation of those templates. So that's my concern, is that a lot of work is done in that way. And one way of going about it is looking at the language, because the language has multiple meanings. It's Ojibwe, for example, that's my language, is 2/3 verbs, whereas the English language is 1/3 verbs. So one thing for sure, outcomes need to be action oriented, because that's the majority focus of the language. And they need to be having multiple meanings, because the language itself, you could say something like we have a word, waweya, and I actually developed a tool based on that, and it means circular. So it can mean going around in a circle. It could also mean that things come full circle. And it also can mean that your journey, your life's journey is full circle. So it's a lot of different ways in terms of how things come together. And we really need to be thinking about what is this multiple meanings, action-based, strength-based, etc.
Thank you, Andrea. And you answered one of the questions that was also posed around language. So thank you very much. We are rounding out our time today, and just a very, very deep appreciation for you joining us today and sharing all of your expertise and wisdom, sharing some of the upcoming opportunities that the IEN is going to be offering. And so I'm certainly looking forward to that. I've already signed up, so I hope to continue learning with you. Just as a follow-up, we do have a questionnaire. We would love to hear from you, what you liked about the session today, and also if you've got any recommendations for us moving forward as we continue our conversation around decolonizing evaluation. And yeah, so again, Andrea, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for joining us. And we will be sure to circulate the recording and all of the wonderful resources that were shared today.
Yes, thank you so much, Andrea. And thank you to everyone who joined us. It's been a wonderful session. There's a lot of thank yous coming into the chat.
Yes. Can you see the
And there
chat?
was a lot of information about what a great session it was. So yeah, thank you so much, Andrea. Is there anything you want to say in closing?
Yeah, really happy to be here. It was wonderful. Great energy in the room. I really appreciate all the registrations for the network. And I really look forward to working with anyone who wants to take this path and step forward. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
A perfect way to end. And folks, you'll see us in your email box.
Yes. And I think that will close our session.